Okay, part three. The story in the story that has a story. So this is the story. He turned to me and began telling his story. The game on the TV had ended and the other men were lounging lazily after their lunch, empty wine glasses and dirty dishes scattered on the table. They looked up when he started talking. I couldn't understand his wine-soaked Spanish, but sat motionless on the stool, my eyes locked on his, listening intently to words I didn't understand. The supervisor leaned on the bar next to me. The old man was still talking, telling, explaining, when the supervisor started to tell me the story. The old man was from the Basque region in northern Spain. He was born during the revolution and grew up with war and the ruthlessness of Francisco Franco. El Cadillo ruled with terror and death. People would just disappear, by the hundreds, then thousands. The old man's father was one of them. His father had been a Basque freedom fighter after the war who had voiced his desire for autonomy. That night, four men kicked open the door and dragged him off to an unmarked grave and executed him. I was staring at the bar. The weight of this laid heavily on me. What hubris I had to think I had problems. I could see a man who had lost everything, lost in grief, and then took up the fight himself. I didn't have the experience of war and the gnawing hunger it produced. The barman slid another beer in front of me, refilling the olive dish. The supervisor continued. The old man had a wife, Rosa. They were young and passionate about the cause. They wanted an autonomous Basque land and used bombs and deceptions to realize that dream. They planned deadly raids and avoided capture for many years, but one fateful night in the early 80s their luck ran out. They were betrayed by a friend who gave them up after weeks of brutal torture. A few days later, his naked body was found in the street, his hands tied behind his back with his torn and bloodied Michael Jackson t-shirt. I looked at the old man and watched a tear fall from the red, sagging rim of his eyes. He held his glass halfway to his lips and quietly said, "Rosa," and finished his wine. The secret police had come to their house and taken Rosa while he was in the orchard. He saw the car pull up and the black uniforms jump from the back and kick the door open. A few seconds later, he heard Rosa scream as she was dragged out the door, heels kicking, body writhing, a discarded shoe landing in the garden. She was screaming his name. He moved to fight, but he had a knife and they had guns. He would be gunned down or worse if he took up the fight. She looked frantically around, hoping he would come over the ridge. The car drove away. She was still screaming as she craned her neck to look out the back window. Their eyes met for an instant before they were lost forever in the dusk. He was, como se dice en inglés, un forjido, un enemy del Estado. An outlaw, I said. Si, an outlaw with the price, the barman said. He had walked at night, taking to the woods. The old man had walked at night, taking to the woods and the old walking paths through the mountains to the sea. He headed for Aruña in a boat to anywhere. He was alone, foraging in the woods, fishing in the streams at night and stealing eggs from the coops along the way. He hid in the desolate mountains for weeks. One evening he sat on a ridge and a man in a cassock walked up at the trail, stopped and leaned heavily on his staff. His face red with exertion, and the once white Nikes were muddied, brown, and worn. He untied the water gourd from his staff and took a long drink. Wiping his beard, he introduced himself as Father Domingos. They shook hands. "And your name, my son?" "Marco. My name is Marco." They talked long into the night, and the next morning, as the priest finished his morning lauds, he turned and asked, "Do you need confession, my son?" "Yes, Padre, forgive me, I do. It has been so long, how can God forgive me?" When his confession was done, the priest sat contemplating the sins he had just heard. What penitence can he give a man who had bombed and terrorized his enemy, a man who ran from the authorities, a wanted man, a man who had cursed God for the lives he had lost? "These sins are very troubling," he started. "You have broken some of God's greatest laws. I cannot offer absolution to you today without knowing what is in your heart." The priest rose and took up his staff. "Come with me on this pilgrimage, and we shall see what is in your heart." Most days they walked in silence, guided by the small stone pillars with the yellow concha emblazoned on the deep blue background. They stopped in small towns and villages to pray, each night welcome to a meal and to sleep on the chapel floor. As they walked, the anger in his heart gave way to the daily pace through the mountains. As they entered a small village and headed for a modest chapel, the priest stopped short and ducked into an alley, pulling Marco with him. A black car was parked in front of the cafe next to the church. 4 black uniformed guardsmen sat at the table drinking wine, their tunics unbuttoned from the unrelenting heat. They leaned back in their chairs and sang loudly to the latest Hall & Oates song. It was 1983 and Maneater was at the top of the charts. Marco stopped as the cold terror shivered down his spine. He looked frantically at the priest and turned to run when one of the guardsmen yelled to the priest. Reaching into his bag, he took out an old cassock and handed it to Marco. "Here, put this on." The cassock fell easily over his emancipated frame. Marco pulled the hood over his head, bowing as they walked slowly to the table, the priest in front, the novice behind. The guardsmen were drunk. The sergeant swung his legs off the table and stood up, mockingly bowing his head to the priest. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned," he said and laughed. "I have sinned a lot. Can you forgive me for that, Father?" He laughed again, drunkenly swaying over to the priest, taking one last drag from his cigarette and blowing in the priest's face. The priest stood his ground, neither flinching nor retaliating. Marco stood behind him, the terror paralyzing his legs that wanted to run. "And who is this?" The sergeant pointed to the hooded cassock standing next to the priest. "He is a novice in the service of the Lord. He is of no importance to you." The sergeant swayed backward once with the wine. "Let me see his face." He turned to the other guardsmen, who were chuckling uneasily. Each could feel their crucifix burning the skin under their tunics. "He is of no concern to you. A novice bound to silence for a year," the priest said offhandedly. "He has been with our order since he was a child, his parents lost to the war." The guardsmen rose from the table and began to noisily collect their things. As they stepped into the street, a harsh wind blew in from the fields, the dust cutting into them, coating their shiny black boots with the red soil. The sergeant turned his back to the wind as if pushed towards the car. The priest and Marco stood very still, both tilting their hoods to the ground, the dust gathering in the folds of their cowls. As the car bumped over the edge of the road and rumbled away, the wind died. The priest turned to Marco and said, "I think it's that way." They continued their walk, stopping along the way to sleep in monasteries and pray with friars in remote chapels. Marco wore the old cassock, and the priest showed him how to tie the cincture around his waist. They walked with the faith of knowing they were walking with God. He would provide what they needed. Over the next week, the trail ran alongside the highway, 4 lanes of cars and trucks belching diesel fumes zooming by like metal horseflies. As they came to Melide, the trail wound its way through the ancient streets to the center of town. They had traveled 700 kilometers along the Camino Norte by the sea and down the mountainous Camino Primitivo. From Melide, where the 2 caminos became one, Santiago was 55 kilometers to the west. As Marco handed the cassock back to the priest, "This isn't my way, Father." The priest smiled and put the cassock into his bag. "No, my son, it isn't." They stayed in an albergue that night, a rustic building with running water and a pilgrim's meal for a few pesos. That night after dinner, they were standing in the square when a white Citroën came around, creakingly around the corner. The car stopped in front of the church, where there was a small pyramid of yellow paint cans. The driver got out and opened the back door, taking out empty paint cans and replacing them with the new ones. His shoes were worn from walking and his hands stained a bright yellow. As he closed the door, he turned to the priest and waved. Marco could see the Roman collar brown with sweat. "Father San Pedro, how are you, my old friend?" San Pedro and the priest embraced one another as brothers. "We went to seminary together so many years ago." San Pedro smiled. "Yes, so many years ago." The priest introduced Marco, and they shook hands, and the yellow paint came off onto Marco's palm. "Sorry about the paint, my son. I am marking the way to Santiago." Father San Pedro was a priest in Osobrero a few miles west. He had been studying the Camino and was on a mission to revive the old trail. He saw something in the Camino that could be shared with the world, but the way was incomplete. Parts through the forest and the fields were unmarked, and the trail in places went on for miles without a marker. Earlier that summer, he had been stopped by many lost pilgrims looking for the direction through his town, the direction to Santiago. That night, he found a can of yellow paint left by the street painters and an old paintbrush. He knelt on the road in front of the church and painted the first arrow. I have marked almost 50 kilometers from Santiago. The rest, he shrugged his shoulders, we'll see. They sat in a cafe and watched the pilgrims walk by, naturally following the flow of the new yellow arrows. The priest looked at Marco and said to Father San Pedro, Marco is looking for a job, Father. Perhaps you could use some help. Marco looked to San Pedro and asked, Do you need help, Padre? Father San Pedro took a sip from his wine. Yes, he said, but on one condition. The priest and Marco leaned forward. It's that you take a bath. The next morning, Marco rose early to watch the sun rise over the hills. The priest sat on a bench reading in the church courtyard. Father, he said, I wish to make my confession. The priest closed the book and they sat together while he gave his confession. At the end, the priest reflected and turned to Marco. I absolve you, my son, he said. The old man had fallen asleep on the bar when the supervisor finished the story. The barman was opening the metal blinds and door, letting in a cooler afternoon breeze. The men in the blue jumpsuits paid the bill and moments later roared their tractors back into the fields. The supervisor took up his clipboard. There's an albergue in town on top of the hill. He waved to the barman and walked into the sunshine, hoping to go back to his icy cold office. I started to gather my pack, the story still reeling in my head. I finished the last of my warm beer, shouldered my pack, and said, La cuenta, the bill, I asked. No pasa nada. It's nothing, the barman said. Buen camino. Stepping back onto the road, I looked at the town on top of the hill and the road laying out in front of me. Always forward, I thought, never straight, and I took the road yet to be traveled. Ooh,